All right. Well, welcome everybody to part one of the practical approaches to designing and implementing specially designed instructional adaptations. And today, Dr. Tessie Rose Bailey is going to talk to you about content. And before we go any further, and I turn this over to Tessie, I do want to go over a few things. I know we've had a few questions about recordings. As I said, today we are recording this session, and the other two will also be recorded and will be shared out to those who registered. We did send out a questionnaire form, so if you have that, I will also put that in the chat in just a moment. You are also welcome to use the Q&A. This meeting has been moved to a webinar due to the increased interest in registering for this webinar. And so what a wonderful thing, right? Like, we're so glad that you're here. And I know that many of you are also joining us today in groups, maybe at your school. And if you are and you're interested in a certificate of attendance, there will be a form for that for you to fill out so that Jennifer Duncan, our administrative assistant, will be emailing you a certificate of attendance. These 3 sessions were 1 hour each, and PTSB requires 7 hours for half credit. So you are able to combine your certificates of attendance along with your other training and with your district, and you can submit that. And then we will have an evaluation at the end of this session. And we really do value your input. We look at that as a team, and we look at how we can best serve you to provide the things that you're needing in your districts or your centers. So please take time to fill out that evaluation. It really is important to us. The other thing that I just want to tell you, following these trainings with Dr. Bailey, we are going to be redoing a book study that we did 2 years ago on specially designed instruction. Registration ends January 31st. Hopefully you have seen those emails. If you have not, let me know and I will make sure to get that out. And I'm going to put it in the chat also so you can register. But it's going to be on Ann Benninghoff's book, Specially Designed Instruction, Increasing Success for Students with Disabilities. It is a wonderful, very practical book that you can literally turn around the next day and use in your classroom. So if you are interested, we will mail you a free book so that you can join us. We will be starting that following Dr. Bailey's 3 sessions, which will end in February. And so we'll start that book study afterwards. So more information to come on that. But without further ado, I don't want to take up any more time. In fact, I'm going to let Dr. Bailey introduce herself so that I don't take any more of that time. And I will be posting links to some of these things that she's going to be referencing. So watch for that in the chat as well. Okay. Thank you. And welcome, Dr. Bailey. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. And I'm super excited to be here. And I can see there are some questions in the chat I'll just address right away. In terms of the printed slides, we won't be sharing them partly because I summarized them all in the handout that you have. Part of that has to do with accessibility and use, but there won't be anything else in here. There are other resources that are referenced that you'll be able to use a QR code to access, or we will be putting some of those links within the chat box so that you can also get to those. So my name is Tessie Bailey, and I'm very excited to be here. I am the director of the Progress Center, which is an OSEP-funded center focused on promoting progress for students with disabilities. I also work with the I'm a center advisor for the National Center on Intensive Intervention, which uses a database individualization approach to designing and implementing specially designed instruction. Some other centers that are related to this work that I also serve as an advisor for are tiered systems of support. If you're doing anything with Tier 3, you will see a lot of the connections, because the intent when it was pushed around 20 years ago was that we would be able to use a Tier 3 model to identify which students needed specially designed instruction through these adaptations and documentation through progress monitoring. So you'll see some references to that throughout this series. The series was really sort of the brainchild of Dina, and you'll see some other components. The book study, there are some online modules that are embedded within the WDE's learning management system. And the intent of all of these, particularly these sessions, is to dive a little bit deeper into the elements of the instruction that IDEA recognizes as part of specially designed instruction. Now, I know there's a lot of special ed teachers on here. You're probably well versed in what this is. But as someone who's responsible for facilitating, let's say, your IEP meeting or working with your paraeducators or leaders, we need to have some common language so that we can develop and implement this specially designed instruction in a sort of feasible way, right, that produces the outcomes that we want. So I'm going to focus on practical approaches, really just to how do we think about this work from a documentation standpoint in the IEP, moving on to the implementation. And that's where the book study will sort of take it into that implementation within your schools. You'll already see the handout, and we'll put that back in the chat box because I know if you weren't here right at the beginning, you won't be able to get access to that. But that handout will list a lot of the resources that I will refer to today, unless there's a QR code, and you'll be able to go directly to that. We did divide this series into 3 parts, and we did it very intentionally. So within the ACT, or IDEA, you will see that the definition of specially designed instruction looks at adaptations to 3 major areas: content, methodology, and delivery. Now, we did content first for 2 reasons. 1, it's listed first in the regulations, but 2, it is the most common adaptation that we think about with specially designed instruction. It also is the one that's the most telling in terms of its ability to address the unique needs of the child because of the disability. So you'll see a through line, you'll see some similarities as we move through this work. Now, Dina mentioned that, throughout the emails that you've been receiving, there was a link to be able to ask questions. In this webinar, you'll have the Q&A, but as you leave, you may be thinking about some things and you want to sort of apply it and then come back. This link will always be available. You'll see it coming through your email, and you can ask a question at any time. So for example, we received a question prior to this session about how, let's say, middle school or high school is using co-teaching in terms of SDI. And we're going to talk a little bit about this in this session, but much more deeply in the next session when we get into that methodology. But those are the types of questions that you can ask at any time. And if it's relevant now, we'll answer it. If not, we'll answer it in other sessions. So I'm going to encourage you throughout the session. You can put in comments. I'll ask you a couple things to share, but also just keep those questions going because it helps us make sure that this is relevant to the work that you're doing in real time. Now, in order for this to be relevant, we kind of all need to be on the same page. And we know there's some very senior special ed teachers and directors out there, but we also know that there are some new folks who are coming into this field. And I want to just get right from the onset is what do we mean when we're talking about specially designed instruction? Now, the regulations around this have not changed for nearly 40 years. But what has changed is the way that we think about them or talk about them within our work. Now, special education has always been defined as specially designed instruction. But some schools only talk about special ed and some schools only talk about specially designed instruction. But there is another definition of specially designed instruction that's much more narrow and precise. And so when we think about special education, as you'll see here in the regulations, we're talking about that specialized instruction that is delivered for a child with a disability that's in the general ed classroom, maybe through a co-teaching model, could be in a pullout within a self-contained setting, a hospital, a special school, or even just within the physical education environment. And so the tip sheet that you see here, if you want to learn more about just general special education, as well as a lot of what we're going to talk about, just identify, put your phone up to that QR code and it'll send you to this free resource. Now, many of you probably know the IEP includes one statement of services and aids that we are proposing to provide to the student over the course of the year. And if you look at the boxes here in green, those are the parts of that statement. You have your related services, which are meant to assist the child with a disability in benefiting from special ed. And as we just heard, special education is specially designed instruction. So those top two boxes are the things that we teach a student to address the needs that result from the disability. There are some other services that we also often offer that sometimes are confused with SDI. And one of those is supplementary aids and services. These are things like accommodations, changes to the curriculum that you might be providing to the student within the general education class, but they are specifically around services provided in the general education to ensure the kid has access to the general curriculum. So you have what we teach, which is where our SDI fits, and then the services and supports that we provide to the student to ensure while they're learning those things, they're able to access and progress in the curriculum. There are some other things that sometimes get confused, which is program modifications. And these are things where we sometimes use the word adapt, but we adapt the environment or we adapt the curriculum. We give the kid a modified curriculum. These are not the same as SDI. These are changes to the overall program provided to the student to ensure that they can have the greatest access to the general curriculum. Regardless of what we do, what you see here is that SDI is working with these other services and supports to ensure the student has access and can progress within the general curriculum. So I just wanted to put that out there to say that this is only one part of a child's success within their school. So this is the same handout. So if you missed the QR code the first time, you can grab it again. But the IDEA, as well as your state regulations, define specially designed instruction. And they use the terminology adapting, which is what we're using in our trainings. And it's adapting three particular areas: content, methodology, or delivery. And that or is important, and that's why we broke it down. You don't need to adapt all aspects of the instruction, but you do need to clearly identify and document which of these elements you are adapting for your specially designed instruction. And if you see in the handout, I've included some of this language so you don't have to take notes or anything. But the intent of the SDI is to address the unique needs of the child, right? And those are the needs that result from the disability. So you could have a kid who has a lot of different needs. They could be homeless, a second language learner, and have a disability. Under the regulations, what we're talking about are the needs that result from the disability and the instruction associated with that. The intent of it is to help the student build the knowledge and skills and strategies to be able to access the general curriculum, particularly peers and the content that's being delivered. So if we break it down, we're looking at these three elements of instruction that we're adapting to help the student gain the knowledge and skills to have a similar experience to school as other kids without disabilities. And so in today's session, we're really just looking at that content adaptation. So just know we'll get to the methodology and delivery, and we're going to laser light focus on the content. So the main question that's really driving what we talk about today is how do we know what content adaptations are needed? And I had mentioned earlier that this is the primary area of adaptation that we see documented in IEPs. And so you probably were, you were asked to bring an IEP. If you pull that out and look at where you've documented it, you probably see some language related to a content. Now, you don't have to do that, but as you'll see as we walk through this, it's going to be really hard to provide just an adaptation and methodology or delivery without saying what's the purpose or focus of that instruction. So the three things that we generally look at in terms of adapting content are what you see here. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into these. And I encourage you to ask questions or share some of your experiences. But the first thing that IEP teams should consider is really the evaluation report. One, we spent a lot of money on it, on time and resources to really understand does this student have a disability and what's the impact of that disability. But it in and of itself determines what was the primary focus or need that this child had for special education. And if we fail to address that in our subsequent IEPs, then we may be sort of found not meeting the unique needs of the child. The other two things are components of your IEP. So you have that in front of you. And where we should be able to see that is the results from the evaluation or those unique needs documented in that present level of performance that then also show up in our annual goals. And that's really where we end up seeing the focus. And if I am, for example, auditing your IEPs, or the state is looking at an evaluation or is monitoring your IEPs, when we think about the substantive requirement for FAPE, we would see a connection between the needs identified in the evaluation report, documented in the present levels, documented in the annual goals, show up in your SDI. So the SDI, if it's not related to any of these three things, then we may not be meeting the unique needs of the child, and in a sense, are not meeting our FAPE obligation. So let's just start with the evaluation report, right? And a lot of us, you might be in high school and the kid was identified, heck, like 10 years ago. But during that process, a lot of data were collected and understanding sort of what is the disability that this child has that ultimately is impacting their ability to fully experience school, right? And it also identifies some of those initial needs for special education, or in this case, SDI. So if you look at what are the requirements, what we would expect to see are our IEP goals and the associated SDI with those IEP goals be related or directly related to those needs within the evaluation report. Now, some of you are probably saying, well, gosh, my evaluation report didn't really help me see that, or it wasn't really clear, it was so long ago. And we'll talk about that. But if you have a kid who was recently identified, this is the primary area in which we would expect SDI content adaptations to exist. The other thing that is really helpful is the identification. And I know a lot of people, or the disability in which the child was identified with. We often don't think about this. And I think there was a period of time where we're like, well, the disability shouldn't predict what services the kid gets. And that is very true. But if we think about the disability itself and the way that it's defined, it already comes with the areas of need that led to the eligibility determination in the first place. And this is often what happens if your evaluation report is not very useful or it's not very clear. Just understanding that this child was identified as a child with a learning disability or an other health impairment or being deaf-blind helps us understand some of the necessary content adaptations that this child might need. So if you look at your handout on page 2, you will actually see some great resources to help you understand if your SDI is appropriate given the child's disability-related needs. So here's an example. If you look at the definition of autism, for example, in IDEA or your state regulations, it already tells you what are some of the areas or the content areas in which this child is struggling, which ultimately led to the eligibility determination. So if you look at here, you'll see, well, this child has an impact on their verbal and nonverbal communication, their social interactions. You keep reading, you see things like resistant to change, sensory experience. And because that is the criteria that the child needed to meet in order to be eligible as a child with autism, then we would want to consider that in terms of potential content adaptations. And the team needs to consider, first and foremost, is does the child need instruction in one or more of these content areas in order to address their disability-related needs, which you already said they had, and ensure that they make progress in the general curriculum. So if you look at page 2 or 3 of that handout, and we're going to do a little example here on the next page, looking at an IEP in which the child has an eligibility determination as autism, I would want to know, to what extent do these content areas impact the child's success within school? Because you said he had that disability, how are we then going to support the student in addressing those impacts? So it's going to be your turn. So if you'll turn to that page 2 or 3 in your handout, and you can access that in the chat box. So if we look at the definition, for example, of other health impairment, and if you think about other health impairment, we often associate it with like ADHD or ADD, but there's a wide range of disabilities that might qualify for that. So a student might have epilepsy or diabetes or something else. And if we look at the need that results from that disability, you'll see that it's limited strength, vitality, alertness, including heightened alertness. So what's happening is this child is being identified because the disability impacts those things, which ultimately impacts their ability to benefit from academic instruction, right? So the question we ask is, what does this child need to be taught in order to address the unique disability-related needs and ensure they have access and can progress in the general curriculum? Now, you're probably thinking, well, gosh, the kid can't read. What we want to look at from a content consideration is, what about this child's disability that started with another health impairment that ultimately led to limitations in the reading, math, or other academic skills? And if we only address the academic skills and not these functional skills that are a result of the disability, we're not really helping the student develop the knowledge, skills, and strategies to be able to be independent within the learning environment. And so we're probably going to see SDI that's both in addressing strategies to address their attention, as well as academic needs that the child has, not really gained over the last couple of years because of the impact of the disability. And if you have questions about that, I'm sure a lot of you are already doing this, but this is where at the onset, like if we were to have someone look at the IEP and say, is it appropriate? I would expect to see that SDI that would connect to what is the primary impact of that disability, preventing the child from fully, accessing the academic instruction and the overall school experience. So the other thing that can be really helpful, and some of you probably already wrote your PLAF statement, so that information is in there, but some of you probably inherited a lot of your IEPs, a kid moves over, or they just start, within your school year. And the PLAF statement, honestly, is where this first conversation comes up with an IEP team about what are potential content adaptations. And it looks at the child's both academic and functional performance. And this was actually part of the reauthorization of IDEA in 2004. And it said, look, you can't just look at academics, because if you look at a disability from its onset, it initially impacts functional performance, which then in the long term will impact academic performance. So as a special education team, you got to look at both areas. And if you're a child who's in a K-12 setting, then you're looking at their involvement in the general curriculum. A lot of people, I think, just mistook this as being academic. But if you really look at the regulations and the guidance that's coming out of OSEP, general education curriculum is school. So it looks at the behavioral supports, anything related to social behaviors, academics, extracurricular activities, lunch, recess. All of these things are part of the general curriculum that a student with a disability is expected to have access to and progress in. If you're in pre-K, we're looking at, what are appropriate activities based on what that student would be expected to participate in. Now, because there were so many questions around this academic and functional performance, OSEP actually provided a little bit of guidance in their preamble. And they defined academic achievement in terms of what we all know is all of these academic performance areas. We talk about math, reading, science, and history. But honestly, kids don't have disabilities in science and history. So what they expected is an IEP team, as they're writing up their present levels of performance and determining what are the content areas, are looking at why is this child failing to perform as expected? What about the disability is preventing them from doing that? Is it an academic knowledge or skill deficit, or is it a functional need, or is it both? And honestly, we often find both, that the student has functional needs, so they'll need that content adaptation, but they've also sort of developed these needs within basic academic skills to be able to participate in the general curriculum. So when we think about the focus of that academic SDI, what we're looking at are the knowledge and the skills and the strategies that this student needs in order to access and progress in the general education curriculum because of the disability, right? So some questions that you'll see here from a consideration standpoint, as you're running your IEP team meeting, is really trying to surface this amongst the team. Why do we think this child is not meeting the academic expectations? Is it because their behavior gets in the way? Is it because they can't see, so they don't see the curriculum, or they can't hear? Or is it because they lack the basic academic skills, whether it's math or reading or writing, to be able to fully participate? And once we determine what are those academic needs, then we say, what does this child need to be taught, right? Because it's not accommodated, that's supplementary aids and services, but what does this child need to be taught so that they're more independent, they're better able to learn in the future, and can progress within that general curriculum? So in your handout, I've included a couple of resources, and I'm going to just share how these can be helpful for you. I think sometimes we get a kid, particularly in the middle. I have 2 high school kids, and we get them and we say, oh my heck, they have so many needs. What are we going to do with this, student? And we need to be able to tease out what are the core basic things that this child needs to be taught to be more independent with their disability. So these are what are considered practice guides. They come from IES. And what they do is highlight 3 to 5 of the primary content areas or methodology, which we'll talk about next time, that students at that grade level or that content need to be taught. So even if we don't really know, because we don't have enough information or we're new to this role, we should be able to select that very focused content relevant to help this student make progress. So here's a good example, and we had some questions about, yes, we'll share all these. All of these links are actually in your handout on the last 2 pages, Teresa. So here's an example. If you click on the link for the teaching strategies for improving algebra. So a lot of you are probably working at the secondary level. You've got some kids struggling in math. And you'll see that these are the 3 primary evidence-based practices, whether it's a content methodology, that will help in the for students who are struggling with algebra. 2 of these are content adaptations. One of those is something the teacher does. So that's a methodology or a delivery. And we'll talk about that in the next 2 sessions. But in this case, you'll say we're going to teach the students to use the structure of algebraic equations or representations, or we're going to teach the student alternative algebraic strategies, right? So it's helping us understand what are the most important things that this child needs to learn given the general curriculum needs. And then we look at that in the context of their disability, right? So if this student is struggling in math, they've got to pass algebra to be able to get their diploma, and that's the impact of the academic impact. Those would be things that would be relevant from a content adaptation. Let's look at it from reading from a K-3 standpoint. So foundational skills, K-3, we often talk about the big ideas, but some of them are more appropriate for content adaptation than others. So if you look here where the 2 arrows are, you'll see that first one is just teaching students the vocabulary to be able to participate in language arts, reading, writing, sort of the oral discussions that are associated with the general curriculum participation. And that vocabulary is often one of those things that prevent kids from fully sort of progressing onto the next stage. We focus a lot on skills, decoding, phonological awareness, but the application of that often gets lost. The second one you'll see is the develop awareness. So this could be an area in terms of that phonological awareness, but what you'll also see is it's not the thing that we focus our instruction on. It's a portion of or a component of our instruction, but if we talked about SDI, we're going to prioritize vocabulary and the actual decoding or analyzing of words, because that's more relevant to the actual putting sentences together to be able to read connected text. There are some other things that are interesting, and we'll come back to these in later sessions, but you'll see that ensuring students read connected text every day. That's not an SDI focus. What that is a delivery adaptation. You're saying that this student needs more opportunities for practice in order to master that skill. And that's how we get to things like this kid needs 45 minutes of SDI versus 30 minutes. So not a content adaptation, but it's more of a delivery adaptation we'll talk about later. So the academics, I think we do a really good job at, because we've been conditioned to think about, how the reading, writing, and mathematics. But the functional performance is one of those things that from a national standpoint, we have not seen the same attention to. And as a result, students with disabilities are learning things, but they're not learning how to be learners. And that's making it difficult for them to sustain learning within a context, meaning they might do good in elementary, but they don't have the learning behaviors necessary to be successful in middle school and high school. So these functional performance looks at how does the student perform in sort of everyday things. Can they get around school? Do they know how to interact? Can they keep up with their stuff? And if you think about why some of the kids that you work with are not performing, it's not that they just don't know how to read connected text. It's that they struggle with attention or organization. They need more practice opportunities. There are other functional aspects that are preventing them from being successful. On the right-hand side, if you think about you'll see this employability skill framework. And if you think about what we need to be in a successful employed person or somebody going to college, a lot of the skills that we need are not really academic, right? So here you'll see those interpersonal skills, self-advocacy, the use of technology, keeping up with my stuff, being able to communicate, critical skills. So these are a lot of those functional behaviors that we often assume kids have, but kids with disabilities, as you look on page 2 and 3 of the handout, often don't have because of the impact of the disability. Now, functional behaviors are a lot more than we probably think. You know, we think a lot about dressing and eating, and we sometimes associate these behaviors with students with more significant disabilities. But to be honest, every one of us needs to be taught appropriate functional behaviors, right? Like, I have a child who has a very severe learning disability in writing. He needs executive functioning. Without that, I, as the sort of facilitator of the learning, am taking the brunt of the work. And I need him to be more independent. I need him to initiate the task. So that's where we think about, it's not that we're just teaching those academic content areas, we're also teaching these functional skills to address the sort of direct impact of that disability. Now, you'll see here the social skills. You know, we sometimes think about that for particular disability categories, but to be honest, it could be any disability category. It could be a student who has autism, a student who has a cognitive disability, students with behavioral challenges or learning disabilities that struggle to sort of stay focused on the conversation. So these are these areas that we need to consider each time we write an IEP and determine, does this child need a content adaptation or SDI in these particular areas? So in your handout, you have page 2, and I'm just going to give you a little second. You can put some of these in the Q&A. It's just take a look, and I'll actually put this up on the screen as well. So in case you don't have access to it. But what you'll see in the handout that was shared on this second page is these are the disability categories that are in IDEA. And what you see below them or within other parts of IDEA are direct reference to these services or content area needs. So if I was to look at an IEP, I would expect to see, for example, a student with a hearing impairment, something related to communication. And that can be very broad, you know, initially as you're learning about the student, but it'll probably get more narrow as you learn more about the child. So just take a moment to look at that handout and think about how many of the disability categories identify functional skill impacts related to it, right? And so I'll just give you about, 30 seconds or so to peruse that. I mean, do you see most of them have functional skill impacts, or is it just certain disability categories? I'll put it back on the screen for some of you who can't see that.
Hey, Tessie, I think some people might be confused. The modules have nothing to do, it is a great resource for you to take those modules prior or in adjacent to these sessions. However, it is not a requirement. The handout that Dr. Bailey is referencing was in your email that was sent to you right before this session, as well as it's posted in the chat. So you can also get it directly from there.
Yep. So somebody noticed that developmental delay was not listed, and partly developmental delay is primarily functional skill behaviors. Yeah, so it was on purpose. It was just the 13 categories to make them very clear at this moment, because developmental delay has such a broad definition in terms of identification. And it's not a permanent disability. It's kind of like a placeholder until a child is identified for one of the primary disability categories. So what do you see in terms of like functional content? Yeah, you notice that at least all of them have at least one functional skill. Yeah, most have functional behaviors. And I would say, like any great IEP should have at least some of the SDI content adaptations related to functional behaviors. We're trying to help a student who has a functional skill impact because of their disability be able to be more successful in the school space. So we need to understand, you know, if I have an orthopedic impairment, I've got mobility challenges. I would expect to see SDI related to things regarding mobility, which is a functional behavior. You look at just general behavior, executive functioning, language, communication. All of these are defined as functional behaviors under IDEA. The other thing is they are critical for post-school success, right? Having academic knowledge is important, but honestly, if we look at what is most predictive of school and post-school success, it's to have these functional behaviors that are often impacted by a disability. So as we think about, you know, these questions and we're getting to an IEP team meeting, we want to ask as a team, how does this disability impact the child's functional skills necessary to access the general academic instruction, the other general curriculum in the school, and be involved in their peers? And those are the things that show up in the PLAF statement that help us determine, that child needs SDI related to that. Yeah, so somebody had mentioned in the chat, this ability to listen and the behavior to focus often makes it really hard for individuals with disabilities to be successful. And we often think about the SDI specific to the academic part, and we don't always focus on the same as, like Tony's mentioning, on these other functional behaviors to help them be a better learner despite that disability. So when we're looking at those content adaptations, we think about what are the functional skills, right, that this child needs to be taught in order to be able to be more successful. And that resource we just shared can help you say, oh my heck, this kid has a diagnosis or an eligibility determination as a child with autism. There are some functional behaviors commonly associated with that. How does it look for this child, and what does this child need to be taught? So in that same handout, you'll see that there are some resources that are available to you. And so that, you know, around behavior, social skills. But I think the biggest thing to think about this is if this child is to be successful, independent in school and post-school, what are those skills that they need? Yeah, so Tony's mentioned the curriculum can be adapted to the content, but the behaviors disrupt that learning. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so Liz is asking about the modules, and in the email that came out, there's a link to the WDE's learning management system. There's 3 great modules in there that are supplements to this. So I definitely would recommend checking those out. So I want to share this last part. I can see my screen, my letters got a little small. But I want to talk about, you know, once we've got that PLAF statement and it's identifying the primary academic and functional needs of the child, where else do we look for content adaptations? And your annual goals, in a sense, are the go-to place. Now, what happens when we look at a PLAF statement? We're thinking about the services that we're going to propose. And remember, from the very beginning, those services include things like your accommodations and modifications, as well as your related services and specially designed instruction. And the PLAF statement determines what goes in there. So everything that that child is being offered is justified within your present level statement. Now, within that, there are some things the child needs to be able to do or to learn. And that's where the annual goals come from. So those annual goals focus on the knowledge or the skills or the strategies that the child needs to learn in order to do better in school or post-school, right? And because these are the things the child is moving towards or learning, we need to teach the child something. So there is a direct connection between the SDI that we propose and the annual goal. And when we're looking at a substantive, an IEP that meets the substantive FAPE requirement, we would expect to see an IEP goal that has the direct SDI connected to it, right? Now, it could be that it's a reading goal and the SDI is both basic academics and functional behaviors, but both of those are working towards the same goal. And what's neat about that is that if we think about that SDI, and if we've selected the right content adaptations and ultimately methodology and delivery, then the student should be progressing on their IEP goals. And if they're not, then what it means is either we've not selected the right content adaptation, methodology adaptation, or delivery adaptation, right? It's kind of accountability for us in terms of the SDI that we proposed. The other services like accommodations, program modifications, those don't show up in the actual annual goals because they're not things we teach the kid. They're things we do. But the SDI is the thing that we're teaching the student. And as a result, we would expect to see changes in behavior, skills, strategies, or knowledge. So somebody said, could you give an example of how a reading goal might include both functional and academic needs? Exactly. I will definitely do that. It's a great one. So let's say I have a student. I'll give my own child. I have an 8th grader. He has very severe dysgraphia. He has an annual goal that's related to writing, like physical writing. He also has very severe anxiety, to the point that he will do every avoidance behavior you have ever seen. And so the goal itself is for him to be able to write 2 paragraphs within a single sitting, right? He gets up like multiple times and he chats and he does all sorts of stuff. Now, in order to do that, he needs 2 skills. He needs 1, the physical act of writing, and 2, the behaviors, the functional behaviors to attend to that task. Now, he's getting 1 program, and within that 1 program, there is SDI related to both the functional and the academic needs of him. I think that sometimes if we put a goal, we think about them as multiple programs. We're like, oh, there's a behavior program for the kid, and then there's the reading program for the kid. But those don't exist in isolation. They're affecting each other. So we need to have a single program that includes SDI that addresses both of those needs. And the outcome, the positive outcome, is that the child could write the two paragraphs independently. So hopefully that helps. And please ask, those are excellent questions. So I just want to give you a chance to sort of stop and reflect about what it looks like. This is just a cut and paste of an IEP model, or, an example that's given. So yours might look a little bit different because you're using an electronic platform or something. But what I'd like you to do is find where your SDI is documented I'll come back, Jenny. Yep. Is documented within your IEP. And look at where those content adaptations are provided. So in this one, people might say oral reading fluency. That is the focus of the SDI, or it could be much broader than that. Oh, so Jenny, the goal itself, before you do that, I want to get to Jenny's question because I think it's excellent. What she's saying is that the goal itself did not address anxiety. It doesn't need to, because the ultimate goal is writing proficiency. The SDI to get the child to writing proficiency includes strategies to address anxiety as well as academics. You don't need a goal for every individual thing that you write. The ultimate outcome is writing proficiency, but your SDI needs to address the needs of all of those. Yeah, what would you do to put into reflect? There are multiple questions about this, and we'll talk a lot about this in the next one. But you have to remember, as a team, we're coming together. The ultimate goal for my child who has a learning disability is for him to write 2 paragraphs independently. The present level of academic achievement and functional performance identified these functional behaviors and academic behaviors that are getting in his way. The goal is writing, right? How I'm going to get that kid to that writing goal has to do with the SDI that I'm proposing to help him get to that goal. If I only had SDI related to writing, he would never achieve that goal. So the SDI that I'm proposing has academic writing aspects as well as behavioral strategy aspects, right? Does that make sense? And so there's a question, do you put the strategies in the objectives? You technically don't have to mention them, right? You don't have to get to that level of detail. What you can actually put, and if you look at the content adaptations on the last page, there's a resource. Actually, I'll show it to you. Hold on one second. Yeah, here. So see this teaching cognitive and metacognitive strategies. There's no single strategy, but my kid needs strategies in order to be able to begin the writing assignment, to sustain the assignment, to finish the writing assignment. So those functional behaviors as well as the actual physical writing, because you can't hold a pencil and stuff. But the goal is physical writing. So in my SDI, in order for the kid to reach that goal, I'm going to teach content related to academics and cognitive and metacognitive strategies, right? And that's a little different because I think we've done this one-to-one correspondence, which is actually very limiting in terms of supporting children. Children's learning is impacted both by their academic and their functional, the connection between the two. So our SDI is not just teaching reading, but teaching reading with reading behaviors, right? Or, because I can teach you how to decode, but you also have to attend to that task to decode, or listen, or see, or, write, or whatever the other functional skills are. And so there is and this is a great supplemental question. It says, at what point do you need to write a social goal? And that's if the primary need of the student is social behaviors. And you can see that, for example, a child who has autism or maybe a behavioral, the primary need that the student is working on is social behaviors. And that's actually here, you'll see this teaching social behaviors. That's where my goal might be. And it's not that the academics are the primary need. They're kind of like because the social behaviors are so bad, he's not paying attention. So we're going to focus on social behaviors. Where my child, the focus was he can't physically write. And there are some things that are contributing to that we also need to address simultaneously. It is the same if you look, for example, at some of these other disabilities. I think about a child with autism, for example, what is the primary need that results from the disability? And if the primary need is that this student cannot attend to the sensory thing that's happening, it doesn't matter how good my reading instruction is. So we have to look at what is the primary need that the child has that's resulting from the disability, and making sure that is the annual goal. And then thinking about what are the things, the content this child needs to be taught to be able to progress towards that goal, right? So even teaching things like responding to routines and sensory experiences, they're likely to be done within the context of academics, but the focus are the social behaviors. Could one SDI statement be true and used for multiple goals? It could be, but I would say if it addresses multiple goals, then you probably need that one goal, right? Because you have a primary goal. You're more likely to see a few goals, 2 to 3 goals, with a broader focus on more needs for a student. So think about a child who has multiple disabilities or a very severe cognitive disability. The goal might be, I don't know, I'm thinking of something like independence and completing like a food preparation or something like that. In order to achieve that goal, you've got to teach a lot of different special things. So you're more likely to have more content adaptations. Sorry, that was for myself. More content adaptations than you are to have goals. Does that help? These are such great questions. And to be honest, there's no one way to do it, but you have to think about what is the intent, right? And so the intent is to say, in order for this child to achieve these goals or develop the knowledge and skill and strategies, then I want to make sure that they're working, on this particular content. Kathy, you hit the nail on the head. So she said, if OHI may need more focus on executive functioning as an annual goal in SDI rather than an academic goal. And that's exactly right? Because the primary impact of the disability is their inability, right, to have appropriate strength or stamina or vitality or alertness. And those limitations are making it hard for them to excel or progress academically. So that would be the primary need. On the flip side, you could have a kid who's had that disability for 5 years, and now they have these comorbid issues, really low academic performance. So we got to do something there, as well as executive functioning. And that's where you might have 2 goals for that student. But it's likely, coming back to the other question, the SDI is, they're probably, it's one program that has 2 goals coming out of it. Yeah, and I think it's why, understanding what is the nature of the disability and how does the disability impact this child helps us make really good decisions about what are those content adaptations. So as you move in, to into our next session, and you're looking at your IEP, then you want to make sure that you're looking at the extent to which your present levels, your annual goals, and your SDI align, because at a minimum, that is your legal obligation. We refer to it as internal consistency that says you said the kid had a need in your PLAF, you set a goal, and you are providing the appropriate content adaptations to help the child achieve those goals. So Marilyn is saying, so if there's a student who qualifies for a learning disability, but their behavior is getting in the way, is it appropriate to have functional goals instead of academic goals? I would say no. And the reason is that child was identified as a child with a learning disability because of needs in academic areas. More likely you would have both. And we see this, a child has a learning disability, they're struggling, they're getting more and more frustrated as they get up into the upper grades. They still have that academic-based learning disability, and now they have some of these other functional behaviors that are manifesting. And we also need to address those pretty significantly. So that's where you might have 2 goals rather than 1. And so there's another question: at what point do you need to write a social goal to cover functional behaviors? Oh, sorry, she said I cut out the end. So I would say if the primary area of need is social skills or social behaviors, like a child with autism, then you would have a goal that's focused on social behaviors. You may also have a goal that's focused on academics if that's the case. So I know we're at time, and I want to make sure that I share the evaluation. And I'll, as the evaluation is up, I'll answer some of these other questions. So does it mean this doesn't mean that we need to modify the content? So yes, that is correct, Kathy. That's why I said there is another service that we provide, which is modifications, program modifications, or if you're doing a supplementary aid and service that's modifying the curriculum or the content being taught to the kid, that's not SDI. So that's a little bit different. And then one more is like, at what point is a goal not functional when it needs to be addressed over multiple years? It is possible that some students, particularly those with more significant disabilities, will have a similar content area, but the nature of that content area gets more specific, more narrow over time, or may evolve over time. So yeah, but I do think that's a question a team needs to ask, is say, this is not what this child needs. We've been working on it for 6 years. It's not appropriate. Let's really think about the functional skills necessary for post-school effects. And I have one more. If you have these comorbid deficits that show up later on, do you need to do a new evaluation? No, you do not need to do a new evaluation. Obviously, you need to meet your requirements for every 3 years, but you do need to collect additional data to really understand that. And that's where the present level of academic and achievement and functional performance allows you to document some of these additional needs for SDI that arise since the evaluation report. So great questions. So the QR code for the feedback is there. I think the link is also in the chat box. We really appreciate your feedback. And in these discussions, I mean, this is what helps us as a field, I think, become, this is what helps us be experts. I'm learning all the time. I'm sure you're seeing new things all the time. And it's about building our general collective efficacy to be able to support students with disabilities. And was one more. I know we're at time. So what about a student who's on the border of needing accommodations and modifications? Remember, those are a supplementary aid and service. So kids will always get those, particularly under 504, even if they have an IEP. But the SDI might shift to transition services or employability skills rather than, let's say, something else. So thanks, Travis. All right, Dina, I know I went 3 minutes over. Even my timer went off and I kept talking. So
you're okay. We just totally appreciate your time and we want to respect your time. And I just want to thank all of you who were able to join us this afternoon. We will be back again for session 2. And so on January 23rd, same time, 4 o'clock. And, you know, if you want to have other people join you, I will be putting in the chat a certificate of attendance sheet for today's session. And so make sure that if you would like this certificate that you fill this form out, and our Jennifer Duncan will be emailing you with your certificate so that you can combine those for PTSB credits. And I just want to tell you, thank you again for this wonderful, wonderful training, Tessie. This has been amazing. Also, just to give you a little spoiler alert, we are going to have Dr. Bailey in person. She will be joining us on July 30th for our SPED conference. And she is going to be running this more like a workshop to give you even more in-depth training on this. And so we're very excited about that. So please make sure you mark that on your calendar. And July 31st will be Christine Manning, who is a behavior expert, and she will be going over the same thing with you for SDI on behavior and functional goals. So very excited about this year's workshop conference. So thank you and have a wonderful night.
Great. And Melissa, the link is in the chat box